In the heart of classical Athens, a city celebrated for its dazzling philosophy, radiant temples, and proud democratic ideals, there lurked a brutal contradiction. Beneath marble columns that preached liberty and civic virtue, a shadowed world thrived. It was a world of chains, of silent suffering, of bodies reduced to property. And at the center of this cruelty were women. Women whose names were erased, whose fates were dictated by violence, and whose existence was stripped down to obedience and survival. What did it truly mean to be a dul, a female slave, in the very society that praised freedom as its highest gift? The question itself cuts like a blade, because the answer is one Athens never wanted remembered. Slavery in ancient Greece was not born overnight. It was not the result of one ruler's decree or a single conquest. Instead, it spread like a slow-growing rot. Centuries of war, raids, piracy, and trade creating an endless supply of captives. By the 5th century BCE, Athens had become a slave society in the fullest sense. Its economy, its households, even its temples were built upon forced labor. But the fate of enslaved women was especially cruel. Torn from distant lands, Thrace, Phrygia, Lydia, the rugged shores of the Black Sea, they arrived as spoils of war or commodities on the auction block. Most were young, some little more than children. Their identities were erased the moment they were sold. A name replaced with a price, a heritage replaced with servitude. While men toiled in fields, mines, or workshops, women were forced into roles far more invasive. They were domestics, yes, scrubbing, weaving, fetching water, but many were also coerced into roles of intimacy, degradation, and public punishment. Their bodies were not only instruments of labor, but instruments of control. In Athens, a city that sang hymns to freedom, enslaved women discovered the bitter truth. Liberty was never meant for them. And the punishments they endured, the unthinkable humiliations inflicted upon them, were designed not merely to hurt, but to erase their humanity. This is the hidden story, the brutal story, the one that Athens itself tried to bury beneath its shining marble and its endless speeches about justice. But tonight we will exhume it. In the radiant glow of the Athenian sun, the city seemed to stand as a monument to human achievement. Marble temples gleamed on the Acropolis, casting long shadows that reached into the crowded streets below. Philosophers gathered in the agora, debating justice, liberty, and the meaning of the good life. Citizens prided themselves on their democracy, boasting that Athens had given mankind the noblest gift, freedom. But beneath this dazzling surface, another Athens thrived. An Athens of back alleys, dim quarters, and silent figures who passed unseen. They were the enslaved, the very foundation upon which the marble city stood. And among them, women bore the heaviest weight of all. To understand their lives, one must first understand the paradox of Athens itself. In the 5th century BCE, it was a city-state in bloom, a superpower of the Greek world, rich from trade and victorious from wars. Its fleets commanded the seas, its treasury swelled with tribute from allied states, and its citizens delighted in theater, festivals, and public life. Yet this abundance was not the result of liberty alone. It was built on bondage. For every citizen who cast his vote, several slaves labored in silence. For every philosopher who pondered virtue, countless others endured cruelty with no voice, no rights, no recognition. Women enslaved in Athens, the doulai, were both invisible and indispensable. Most had been captured in war, ripped from families in Thrace, Phrygia, Lydia, or lands bordering the Black Sea. Some had been born into slavery, their mothers already bound when they were born. From the moment of capture, their fates were sealed. They were stripped of identity, renamed, sold, and distributed like property. Where a free Athenian woman might retreat to the safety of her household, bound by custom and modesty, the enslaved woman knew no such shelter. She existed in every space where labor was needed, and in every role where control could be asserted. Her mornings began long before dawn. By the time the first hints of light brushed the horizon, she was already at work, fetching water from fountains, grinding grain into flour, weaving at the loom. These tasks were endless, each designed to consume her hours, leaving no space for thought of rebellion or freedom. Her hands, blistered from labor, were instruments of survival, but also reminders of captivity. For no matter how skilled her weaving, how smooth her bread, how perfect her service, she remained bound. Beyond household chores lay roles far darker. Enslaved women were often pressed into intimate service, used as concubines or forced companions. Unlike freeborn women, who were expected to remain secluded and modest, enslaved women were exposed to the whims of men, masters, guests, or strangers. Their bodies were seen as extensions of their labor, commodities to be used, traded, or punished. In this way, their slavery was twofold, both of body and of spirit. Athens prided itself on its laws, yet these laws offered enslaved women no refuge. A master could beat, starve, or humiliate them without fear of punishment. If an enslaved woman sought justice, she could not appear in court on her own behalf. Her testimony was only admissible under torture, a cruel irony that silenced her voice even further. Thus she lived in a constant state of exposure, visible in her labor, invisible in her suffering. The city itself reminded her of her place. In the bustling agora, where citizens debated the meaning of justice, enslaved women hurried with baskets unnoticed except when reprimanded. At festivals, they were forced to prepare feasts they could never partake in, serving food and wine they would never enjoy. In religious rituals, they stood at the margins performing the dirtiest tasks so that citizens might feel pure before the gods. Even in death, their fate was denied dignity. Buried in unmarked graves or tossed into pits, their names dissolved with their bodies, their existence forgotten by the city they had built with their labor. Yet within this cruelty lay the deepest contradiction of Athens. For the same men who declared liberty a sacred right could not imagine that liberty extending beyond themselves. Freedom was a word for citizens, not for women, not for foreigners, and certainly not for slaves. Thus the enslaved woman stood as a living paradox, a constant reminder that Athens' glory was purchased with human suffering. The punishments inflicted upon these women were as varied as they were cruel. A disobedient jewel might be whipped before others as a warning. A suspected thief might be branded, her flesh permanently scarred with the mark of her crime. Those who resisted sexual advances might face public humiliation, stripped and paraded before jeering crowds. These punishments were not just physical, they were designed to break the spirit, to remind the enslaved of their powerlessness, and to enforce silence. But silence was not the same as acceptance. Beneath lowered eyes and weary hands, enslaved women carried memories of families left behind, of songs once sung, of lives that could have been. These memories, though buried, remained sparks of defiance. Even small acts, a glance exchanged with another, a secret word whispered at night, a hidden ritual of their homeland, became quiet rebellions, ways to cling to identity in a world intent on erasing it. Still, the cost of defiance was steep. Masters and mistresses alike sought to control every aspect of an enslaved woman's existence. Punishments were often public, meant to display authority and deter others. The whip cracked not just across skin, but across community, sending a message to all who watched. Submission was survival. In this way, fear became as much a tool as chains or locks. Yet Athens depended on these women. Without their labor, households would falter, children would go unwashed, looms would sit idle, bread would remain unbaked. The city's famed leisure, which allowed men to gather in assemblies and courts, rested on the unseen work of slaves. Even in the sacred sphere, their presence was unavoidable. They tended altars, cleaned temples, and prepared offerings to the gods, an irony that did not escape notice, though it was rarely spoken aloud. The city worshipped Athena, goddess of wisdom, yet denied wisdom to the very women who labored in her name. As the golden age of Athens flourished, so too did its hidden cruelties. War brought new captives, feeding the markets where women were auctioned like livestock. Wealthy households collected slaves as symbols of status, while poorer citizens owned one or two to ease their burdens. Everywhere the enslaved were reminders of power, wealth, and control. And among them, women bore the weight of the most intimate degradations. In this cruel balance, Athens revealed its truth. The liberty it so proudly proclaimed was never universal. It was selective, conditional, a privilege. For the few built on the suffering of the many. The enslaved woman embodied this hypocrisy in her very being. She moved through the city like a ghost, seen but never acknowledged, vital but never valued, indispensable but never free. And yet, her story endures not in the speeches of philosophers or the triumphs of generals, but in the silence she carried. For within that silence lies a question too dangerous for Athens to answer. How could a society that worshipped freedom survive on chains? Athens was a city that loved to display its order. On its polished marble, in its festivals, in the shining speeches of its orators, it proclaimed that it was the model of civilization. Yet for enslaved women, order meant surveillance, punishment, and humiliation. Their every movement was measured against an invisible line. To step across it even unknowingly meant pain. The punishments began with the lash. In a world where obedience was demanded without question, the whip became both teacher and reminder. The sound of leather striking flesh was not uncommon in the crowded homes of Athens. It was sharp, echoing through narrow courtyards, warning not only the one being punished but all who witnessed it. The lashes were rarely given in private. Public pain ensured public obedience. Her doul, who spilled water, failed to rise early enough or looked her master in the eye, might find herself stripped to the waist, forced before others, and whipped until her skin split. The punishment was not meant to correct the mistake. It was meant to brand obedience into her very memory. But whips were only one tool. Branding was another. In some households, women accused of theft or disobedience were pressed with heated irons. Symbols seared into their skin marked them as untrustworthy. The brand was permanent, visible proof of their degradation. It did more than scar the flesh. It isolated the woman from even her fellow slaves. She became a warning, her body an eternal message of her powerlessness. Branded women moved through Athens as living reminders that no crime went unpunished, no resistance uncrushed. Athens prided itself on justice, but the enslaved woman knew justice only through pain. For her, courts and laws were distant monuments. She could not testify freely. Her word was meaningless unless forced from her under torture. Thus, the very idea of justice was turned against her. Torture was not the exception. It was the means of extracting truth from those who were denied voices. To live as an enslaved woman was to know that even truth was pain. The degradations extended into her daily tasks. Fetching water from public fountains, she was made to carry heavy jars, sometimes twice her own weight, while citizens watched. If she faltered, if she spilled even a drop, rebuke or blows followed. In weaving rooms, she bent over looms for hours, her back aching, her fingers raw, yet there was no reprieve. If her weaving did not meet the mistress's expectations, the punishment could be as cruel as withholding food, or locking her in storerooms until the task was redone. Hunger became another weapon of control. The deepest humiliations, however, were not of labor but of the body. In Athens, the enslaved woman had no right to say no. She existed in a space where consent was meaningless. Masters demanded her for pleasure as easily as for weaving or baking. Guests might be offered her body as casually as a cup of wine. For the doule, resistance could mean whipping, starvation, or worse. Submission was survival, but survival cost the self. Many lived as shadows of themselves, their identities fractured by endless violation. What made this more unbearable was the hypocrisy that surrounded it. Free Athenian women were guarded within their homes, expected to embody chastity and modesty. Enslaved women, however, were deliberately exposed. They were made examples of contrast. The pureness of the citizen's daughter proved by the degradation of the slave. Thus the doule's suffering was not hidden but flaunted, ensuring that even virtue itself was built upon her degradation. Festivals offered no escape. During great celebrations, when Athens lit its streets with torches and filled its air with music, enslaved women were forced into tireless preparation. They cooked the feasts, fetched water for wine, prepared costumes for rituals, and cleaned the aftermath when citizens lay drunk in the streets. But sometimes they themselves became part of the spectacle. Accused women might be paraded, stripped, and mocked before crowds. In a society that loved theater, cruelty itself became performance. The line between punishment and entertainment blurred, and the enslaved woman was made spectacle against her will. Religious rituals, too, carried their own burden. While citizens prayed to the gods for freedom, victory, and prosperity, enslaved women were tasked with maintaining the sacred spaces. They scrubbed temple floors, prepared sacrificial animals, and cleaned altars after ceremonies. They did the work that allowed citizens to feel pure before the gods, yet they themselves remained polluted in the eyes of society. No matter how faithfully they served, they could never share in the prayers of liberty. Their very presence was tolerated only as labor, never as devotion. The punishments could also be psychological. A woman might be forced to wear degrading garments, shaved of her hair, or paraded with signs declaring her as thief or liar. These were not just punishments but erasures, attempts to strip away dignity, identity, and memory. In a society where honor was everything, dishonor became a chain heavier than iron. Even the family was denied to them. Enslaved women bore children, but those children did not belong to them. Offspring of slaves were considered the property of the master, to be kept, sold, or discarded at will. To cradle a child was to know that at any moment he or she might be taken away, sold to another household, or condemned to the same life of bondage. Motherhood itself was turned into a weapon of suffering. To love one's child was to live in constant fear of loss. And still the city thrived on their labor. Without the doula, homes would falter, workshops collapse, and festivals falter. The luxury of citizen leisure was carved from their exhaustion. The brilliance of Athens, its plays, its debates, its democracy, rested silently on their shoulders. Yet the more indispensable they became, the harsher the punishments grew. The enslaved woman could not be allowed to forget her place, for if she did, the balance of power might crumble. Fear was the city's insurance. This was why punishments were not only cruel but spectacular. They were reminders not just for the enslaved, but for all who watched. Masters displayed their power through pain, making examples of women to assure obedience among others. Even children of citizens grew up watching these punishments, learning early that liberty was built on chains, that their comfort was secured by another's suffering. Thus, cruelty became normal, absorbed into the rhythm of life, unquestioned even by those who prided themselves on philosophy and justice. As the years passed, the burden deepened. Wars brought more captives, swelling the markets where young women were bought and sold. Some were so young they had no memory of freedom at all. Others carried the trauma of capture, their families slain or scattered. Each carried wounds invisible to citizens, the pain of loss, the ache of memories, the weight of endless labor. Their punishments became not just events but lifetimes. Every day carried humiliation, every task the possibility of pain, every breath the reminder of chains. And yet, within this suffering, the city's hypocrisy shone most clearly. Athens declared that slavery was natural, that some were born to rule and others to serve. Philosophers debated the nature of justice, while ignoring the enslaved women who served them food and washed their garments. They praised freedom as man's highest virtue, but denied it to half their own population, and to every slave who walked their streets. The enslaved woman was not only a victim of punishment, she was the mirror of Athens' contradictions. Her suffering exposed the lie at the heart of its glory. The rising tension of her life was unrelenting. Every punishment was both a wound and a warning. Every humiliation was both personal and political. And as the punishments grew harsher, the question became impossible to ignore. How long could a city that worshipped freedom sustain itself on such cruelty? The punishments had always been cruel, but there came moments when cruelty was sharpened into spectacle, when the suffering of enslaved women became not only discipline, but performance. It was in these moments that Athens revealed its deepest contradiction, and it was in these moments that the duel's agony reached its peak. One such moment was the market punishment. When a woman was accused of theft, true or not, her trial was not conducted in courtrooms but in the open square. She was dragged to the agora, stripped of her dignity before merchants, citizens, and strangers. There, before the very stones where philosophers debated justice, she was bound to a post. The lash tore across her back, not in silence, but to the jeers of those who watched. Some hurled insults, others fruit, all taking part in the ritual of humiliation. Her body became a canvas for punishment, her pain a public entertainment. When the branding iron was pressed against her skin, the stench of burning flesh mingled with the laughter of the crowd. Athens, the city of reason, had turned her suffering into theater. But public punishment was not limited to theft. Resistance, even the smallest act of defiance, could provoke savage retribution. A woman who refused her master's touch or who spoke back might be paraded through the streets in chains. Sometimes her hair was shaved, a mark of disgrace. Sometimes she was forced to wear mocking signs declaring her guilt. The punishment was not merely physical. It was psychological warfare, designed to shatter her spirit and remind every other enslaved woman that her body, her will, her very existence belonged to another. Worse still were the punishments of religious desecration. In a city where ritual purity mattered, enslaved women could be accused of polluting sacred spaces. A woman who accidentally broke a vessel at a temple or mishandled an offering could be whipped before the altar, her punishment carried out in the name of the gods. To suffer in the shadow of a temple was to be doubly cursed, condemned by society, and cast as an offense to the divine. These punishments etched into her mind the belief that she was not only unworthy of freedom, but unworthy even of the God's mercy. The greatest cruelty, however, was reserved for those who tried to escape. The runaway woman, if captured, faced punishments designed to erase the very thought of freedom. Some were branded with marks declaring them fugitives, a permanent reminder of their attempted rebellion. Others were forced to wear heavy shackles for life, their bodies condemned to carry iron as second skin. In the worst cases, they were executed. Not swiftly, but slowly, their deaths meant to terrify others. The city did not fear losing one enslaved woman. It feared the contagion of hope she carried. By destroying her body in public, Athens sought to destroy the possibility of resistance itself. The climax of this cruelty was not in a single act, but in its accumulation. The enslaved woman's life was a litany of punishments: the whip, the brand, the hunger, the violation, the humiliation. Each wound was layered upon the last, until her very existence became a testament to suffering. She was broken not once but every day in countless ways, and yet the cruelty never achieved what it sought. For even as she was crushed, her suffering revealed the truth Athens tried to conceal. Every lash, every scar, every public humiliation shouted the hypocrisy of a city that worshipped freedom while chaining women in its streets. The climax is this revelation, that Athens' greatness, its democracy, its philosophy, its art, all stood upon the broken bodies of enslaved women. The city that built the Parthenon also built prisons of flesh. The men who praised liberty with silver tongues enforced silence with iron chains. The philosophers who pondered the soul denied the souls of those who served them. The doula was both invisible and inescapable, erased from history, but written into every stone of Athens by her labor, her suffering, and her punishment. In her pain, the city was exposed. Athens could polish its marble, fill its theaters, and crown its generals with glory, but it could never erase the truth carved into the flesh of its enslaved women. They were the silent witnesses, the hidden foundation, the voices the city tried to crush but could never fully silence. And though history forgot their names, their suffering remains the darkest truth of the brightest city. This was the breaking point, the moment when cruelty no longer disciplined but destroyed, when punishment ceased to be correction and became annihilation. The duel at the center of this climax no longer stood as an individual, but as a symbol of every enslaved woman in Athens. Her body, scarred and humiliated, was not only her own but the collective memory of all who endured. The climax of her suffering is the climax of Athens' hypocrisy, a city that crowned itself with freedom even as it buried women in chains. When the whips fell silent and the branding irons cooled, Athens returned to its daily rhythm. Citizens filled the agora, merchants haggled over grain, philosophers debated beneath shaded porticos, and children played in the dust of the streets. Life went on as though nothing had happened. But for the enslaved women, the echoes of punishment lingered in every corner of the city. The scars etched into their bodies never faded. The fear instilled in their minds never loosened its grip. The silence they carried was as heavy as the chains that bound them. Athens prided itself on being eternal, on leaving monuments that would outlast the ages. The Parthenon rose proudly on its hill, white marble gleaming against the sky. Yet beneath those stones were the unseen foundations of suffering. Every block was hauled, every tool prepared, every task supported by enslaved labor. Women ground the grain that fed the builders, wove the garments worn in ceremonies, and tended the households that freed citizens to dream of greatness. Their work remained hidden, their names erased, but their presence was woven into every achievement Athens claimed as its own. The douli did not leave written records of their lives. History preserved the speeches of orators, the plays of dramatists, the musings of philosophers, but the voices of women in chains were silenced. What remains are fragments, inscriptions mentioning slaves as property, accounts of punishments, legal texts describing their lack of rights. These fragments speak not of the women themselves, but of how society saw them. Their humanity, their thoughts, their dreams, all are lost. This silence is not accidental. It was enforced. To deny them voice was to deny them history, to ensure that future generations would see Athens as a city of freedom rather than a city of chains. Yet silence itself is a testimony. In the absence of their words, their suffering becomes the only story that can be told. The lash, the brand, the humiliation, these were their voices carved into their bodies and carried across generations. Though forgotten in life, their pain has endured as the shadowed truth of Athens' glory. The contradiction was never resolved. Athens fell, its empire crumbled, its democracy collapsed. Yet the memory of its greatness endured, celebrated across centuries as the birthplace of freedom. But what of the Doulai? Their erasure was complete. Few remembered them, fewer still honored them. And yet their existence haunts the very idea of freedom. For what is liberty if it is built on chains? What is democracy if it is purchased with suffering? The impact of their lives stretches far beyond the stones of Athens. Their story is not confined to one city or one time. Across centuries, across continents, the pattern repeated. Civilizations proclaiming liberty while binding others in servitude. Societies praising virtue while degrading women. Powers celebrating progress while silencing those who made it possible. The Duel of Athens stands not only as a figure of the past, but as a mirror for all history. Her suffering forces the question, can greatness ever be pure if it is built on cruelty? Athens answered with silence. Its monuments stood, but they could not erase the truth hidden beneath them. The duel's punishment, her humiliation, her erasure, these were the foundation stones, invisible but essential. Without her, Athens would not have thrived, and yet she was denied even the dignity of a name. To tell her story now is to break that silence. It is to remember what Athens sought to forget, to shine light on the shadows cast by marble and myth. It is to say that the Doulai existed, that they labored, that they suffered, and that their pain was not meaningless. Their erasure was deliberate, but memory can be reclaimed. The final impact lies not in Athens' achievements, but in its hypocrisy. A city that taught the world to revere freedom, also taught the world how easily freedom can be denied. Its democracy was real, but so were its chains. Its philosophy soared, but so did its cruelty. The duel embodies this paradox, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that liberty for some has too often meant slavery for others. And so we end not with marble temples or golden words, but with a question Athens never asked, and one that still echoes across history. How many voices must be silenced for freedom to be heard?